Okay, there we go. So, yes, people who live alone, people who are isolated, they're at greater risk of suicide right now also.
Yes,
Oh,
and
that's,
someone said it's going to increase depression, which is definitely
mhm,
true. That
yes.
depression is going to increase due to social isolation. And
Mhm,
people, I think that the interactions that we have via Zoom, telephone, is really not enough for some of these people who were already feeling, the symptoms of suicidal ideation. So it may increase. And then some of the tragic instances of, losing jobs, as well as, they already have to be social isolated. They already have the
mhm.
children at home, and then they're laid off and not knowing when they'll go back. And so all of these things happening at once can really increase the anxiety, as someone said, the depression, and
Mhm.
can actually lead to suicide, increased suicide attempts.
Yes, and someone also made a great point in the chat that there might be an underrepresentation of suicide rates given the comorbidity of eating disorders and other mental health conditions, which is a great point because people will attribute um, some deaths to other things when it is suicide, actually. So, yes, it's a great point. And then someone put about people's increased fears of contracting COVID-19 may lead to suicide, or people who have it and are scared might turn to suicide as well. Yes, and I love this. Someone put about as clinicians and mental health professionals, normalizing this sense of loneliness and isolation and financial burden and stress that everyone is feeling. So looking at it as more of a collective trauma as opposed to this great trauma that so many people are facing individually will help in decreasing those risks and decreasing that vulnerability. Yeah, great points, y'all. Thank you so much. So here we've added this great visual from the CDC showing the numbers of suicide, deaths by suicide per capita. So here you can see that the states in the dark red are the states with the highest rates of suicidality. So one of the things that a question I want to pose to you all is we know that you all are joining us from across the country. So as you look at your states, what are some things that you're noticing? And as you look at the states that have the highest rates, what patterns are you noticing may be contributing to those higher suicide rates in certain states? So feel free to talk or put it in the chat, whichever way is easier for you. Yes, the isolation in rural areas, certainly.
Weather.
The weather, yes. So states with lots of long, gloomy winters have higher suicide rates. Poverty rates, yes, absolutely. Places that are less populated and therefore have higher levels of isolation.
Income
Um,
opportunities.
yes, yes. Yeah, so somebody put that they thought that some of the states in the Northeast would be higher, as well as Texas being higher. Underestimating the effects of weather. Yeah, yeah. And you have to figure that when the weather is really gloomy, not only does that decrease your vitamin C and D and therefore lead to increased rates of depression, but you're also having to isolate more, right? People aren't going to be out and about when it's snowy and having blizzards and whatnot. So they're more likely to feel the effects of isolation as well.
Now, why do you
Yeah.
think it's important for those that are in roles where they interact with different populations, or like you all had many counselors here? Why is it important to know the impacts of the area you are on, possible impacts on that can influence mental health within your area? Why is it important to even know this? Anybody?
Yeah, so we know where to start, how to get buy-in from other stakeholders.
And for context, you need to
Mm-hmm.
have all the different things. You need to know if it's seasonal depression, right? You need to look at all the different factors that can play a role into what's going on, especially if you're dealing with youth. I
Mm-hmm.
think someone said they were dealing with it from several youth. Why is that so? Was it related to something? Is it seasonal, right? Is it because of where they are? Is it a lack of resources, such as a lack of things to do, a lack of outlets? Income, all of those things. Our children taking on more of the adult issues within their household because it's
Mm-hmm.
in a very low socioeconomic status area. So understanding all of that helps to bring context to how you can better assist in working with these individuals.
Yes, and someone also put that
Mhm.
about in rural areas having lack of access to mental health professionals. This is absolutely true. So one thing to keep in mind if you are working in a rural community is thinking about how can I maybe make myself more available, possibly through telehealth, right? Which is something that a lot of us are having to try our hands at right now and get increased training on now during COVID. So maybe considering post-COVID-19, perhaps opening your practice up and your services up to telehealth so that individuals in more rural areas have access to those mental health services as well. I also saw that someone put that during the summer, children as well as adults might lose their routine, which can be a source of comfort for individuals, which may cause spikes in suicide. So yes, these are great points that you all are bringing up. Thank you so much.
Another thing is that in rural areas, often what we found is that individuals who have dual diagnosis have it much harder in finding someone to really meet all of their needs. The
Mm-hmm.
facilities that they do have do not cater to dual diagnosis. So really thinking about how you as a practitioner in those areas can meet the need of the community, maybe specializing in the individuals with more complex diagnoses.
Mm-hmm. Yes. All right, so when you think about suicide, why do you think it is that some individuals aren't seeking help to begin with?
Fear. Mm-hmm.
Fear, absolutely. Feeling ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Stigma, absolutely. Mistrust, oh, that's such a big one, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know where to go, absolutely, yeah. If you don't know where to seek help, then how are you going to get that help?
And then financial, right? Help
Mm-hmm.
is not free all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hopelessness and feeling that they're beyond help and that there's nothing else to do. I see a lot of people have put cultural barriers.
Mhm.
Yes.
Family.
Yeah. Yes, that's such a good one. Prioritizing the hierarchy of needs. Yeah, if you don't have kind of those basic needs met when we think of Maslow's hierarchy, then your mental health is going to be lower on the totem pole, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. Yeah. All right, so when we're talking about stigma, it's important that we look at some of the sources of where the stigma is coming from in order to help combat it. So the media. Unfortunately, the media is not always the best representation of help-seeking behavior. And as we can see in many different shows who discuss suicide, unfortunately, sometimes shows possibly unintentionally further the stigma as opposed to decreasing it.
Mm-hmm. And even though there is a lot of celebrities today that are coming out
Mm-hmm.
and really advocating for mental wellness and really being transparent and sharing their own mental health journey, there's still so much more in the messages that come out from the media that actually combats that and goes against that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then something that someone else had mentioned earlier. So those cultural values and expectations, right? So especially in a lot of minoritized groups, the help seeking behavior tends to be seeking help within your own community before going out to medical and mental health experts if they're comfortable going out to those experts at all. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Yes, yes. I love that someone put in the chat that a lot of the times the media romanticizes um, suicide as well, instead of encouraging help-seeking behaviors. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more later in talking about the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why. I
But
also,
I did like that she
mhm,
put also in the chat room that they are saying language is a barrier. And that's really important. It's really important with youth because they don't really know how they're feeling until you sometimes have to use a number of different ways to get to them so that they can
mhm,
understand what their feelings. Many people can't name but a few feelings, like,
mhm,
love, happiness, sadness, and that's it, right?
mhm,
And so teaching them how, what the feelings are so that they can really name them and have the appropriate language to really tell you what they need. We're seeing more and more deaths for very young children who really can't tell you anything that's going on because they don't understand it themselves. And so we have to be the ones to give them the words so that they can
mhm.
say, yes, that's me. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
So that's a big issue.
Yeah, and one thing that I've noticed in working with little kids is how so many of them, their only words to describe how they're feeling is good, bad, and okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that doesn't tell us very much, and that makes it a lot harder for us to assess and notice those red flags for suicidality. So one of the things that can be really helpful is teaching your clients from the very start of the therapeutic process, helping to increase their emotional vocabulary. And when we talk about language, also being mindful that in some cultures and in some languages in different regions of the world, there are no words for certain emotions, right? So helping to teach them those words as well. And as far as language, also knowing how to get in touch with translators in case you are faced with a non-English speaking client.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Yeah, someone put in the chat about making sure, especially when we're talking about kids and crisis intervention, making sure they understand that hospitalization isn't always the first step. So helping them to realize that sometimes we can just help them to create that safety plan when we're able to get them help early. That's a great point. Yeah, so other sources of stigma. So the language that we use, both as professionals and as a society. So when we use the term committed, when we say committed suicide, it kind of equates it to crimes, right? And something bad and shameful and something that shouldn't be done. Because when we talk about crimes, we talk about committing crimes. So by using the term committed as opposed to completed or attempted suicide, it can be very stigmatizing as well. So just kind of being mindful of the power of the language that we use and model. Something that many of you mentioned in the chat earlier, fear and lack of trust. We also have to be mindful of the historical distrust that many ethnic groups face when it comes to medical professionals as well as mental health professionals. And that historically, the medical professions haven't been very kind to certain ethnic groups. So that might kind of feed into that fear of professional help seeking as well as not trusting us. So it's going to be really important that we are building this trust and this rapport in the community so they're comfortable coming to us in the first place. And that's something we're going to talk a lot more about later.
I think it's important to also know the history of mental health for certain ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, I learned that during slavery, the very first hospital, they called it the lunatic asylum. And they would say that the only people that would go crazy were people who were free slaves.
Mm-hmm.
Free slaves were the ones that were more prone to going crazy. And this is language that they used during that time. And so that really that gives mental health a stigma, and it dates back historically. Now, how has that been translated over generations, right? To not trust mental health professionals, to not trust them because it began with this sort of lie to keep people in slavery. And so understanding the historical context around mental health is so important, especially when you're working with diverse populations, because many of these type of distrust or lack of trust has been shared generation to generation without really putting meaning behind it. It's just been shared as if we are very private family. We'll keep this in our, in our home, and we don't go get help. We will go to the church. You know, it's been really tied to religious stuff. So really understanding that historical is really important.
Yeah, and I see that Angel shared in the chat the actual diagnosis that was used in naming runaway slaves,
Mm-hmm.
and how that was stigmatized as well. So it was seen as a mental health condition if you ran away for your own freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else put about how that kind of mental health abuse is translated into our DNA. Yes, yes. So there is newer research showing that trauma and intergenerational trauma translates into our DNA. So then it's literally passed down through our DNA from one generation to another, in addition to our behaviors being passed down from one generation to another. So things to keep in mind and make sure that we're educated on is how the Trail of Tears and colonization and the Tuskegee experiment, and how all of these forms of medical abuse against individuals, the medical abuse that was done against individuals during the Holocaust, right? So keeping in mind how all of those things may lead to distrust of the medical professions, including mental health professionals. Yeah, so other sources of stigma, just the lack of information, right? If you don't know something, then it's easier to speculate the worst about it and to not fully understand it. So that's why it's important that as mental health professionals that we're helping to disseminate information and helping to disseminate accurate information, making sure the information that we are passing out in our communities isn't stigmatized information as well.
Think that what's really important is this idea of mental health literacy and understanding that not everyone understands it. And so really taking the time to explain diagnosis to people is going to be so important in gaining that trust and putting it in terms that they understand instead of all of these different technical terms that we know and we're familiar with. It doesn't mean that they actually understand it. And so we have to be a part of that, educating them as well as trying to help them. But without the education, without them really understanding why the education is important or why the help is important, they won't buy into it, especially for many cultures, some of these cultures that we talked about who have this historical history, that education is going to be really, really important because in some families, they have had illnesses that ran within that family, but they never talked about it. So they didn't know if Aunt Shirley actually had this or not because Aunt Shirley, no one ever talked about Aunt Shirley, right? Aunt Shirley was
Right.
just off to her own, so no one knew this. And
Right.
so we have to be able to explain that.
Yeah, and also in being culturally competent in the help that we provide, we also need to be mindful that a lot of families might use different terminology, right? So, oh, they weren't well. So, certain family members weren't well, or oh, they were just a nervous person, right? Instead of actually kind of expanding on and discussing the actual mental health diagnoses that these family members might have. So then it kind of puts later generations at a disadvantage because they don't realize like, oh wait, I'm already at risk for these certain mental health conditions that can later kind of contribute to suicidality because it's something that wasn't discussed, so they weren't able to seek help further earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sometimes religious and spiritual teachings, right? So how many of us have heard clients or just individuals in the community saying like, oh, so-and-so is possessed, or oh, that's the devil talking, and those sorts of things. So then individuals may not seek help because that's something that they believe. Whereas helping them to realize like there might actually be something else going on might help them to seek the help that they need. As well. And then the harmful narratives that we as a society tend to perpetuate, right? So being told that suicide is selfish. I can't count how many times I've even heard mental health professionals say, well, so-and-so was just being selfish. They didn't think about their family and what was going to be left behind. And it's important that we help family members, especially parents, to recognize that when a person is suicidal, they're thinking of their family and they are thinking of their loved ones, but they're thinking of it in terms of, I'm a burden. So if I am gone, if I'm no longer a part of this equation, then I'm actually doing a greater service to my family and my loved ones because they're no longer being burned by me. So it's definitely not selfish, because most of the time the people that they're thinking about are those that they love most. They're just seeing it through a different lens than their family members are. And also telling children, especially children, and we see this with adults as well, just saying, oh, they're attention seeking. They just want attention. Well, what is it that's going on in their life that they might need this attention? And would you prefer to just assume that it's attention seeking behavior and therefore ignore it and risk them completing suicide or attempting suicide, instead of kind of reaching out to that person and saying, like, what's going on? How can I help you? How can I support you? Right? So kind of stressing to parents as well as fellow professionals the importance of seeing every red flag as serious, right? And assume that everyone that you see a red flag in is suicidal, instead of just kind of dismissing some as help-seeking behaviors. Or, I'm sorry, attention-seeking behaviors. And kind of having that narrative of, oh, they won't really do it. They're chicken. They would never do that, and things of that nature, because it's the individuals that you often least expect who will actually attempt or complete suicide. Mm-hmm. Dr. Key, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay. All right. All right, so there's like 3 different kind of loops that we need to keep an eye on and work in, right? So we need to work at how we reduce stigma at a societal level, at a community level, and then within individual families. Mm-hmm. So at a societal level, things that we need to keep in mind are certain challenges that individuals face. So inequities. We see increased rates of suicidality among minoritized groups, both ethnic minority groups, as well as among individuals with affectional and gender expansive identities, especially in youth aspects of this population. Because something we also know is that there's a much higher rate of homelessness among those identifying as LGBTQIA+. So that also kind of lends itself to a higher rate of suicidality as well, because of those limited resources that are available to them. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, media influence. So during the time that I was working in the high school and seeing clients in the high school, there was so much talk about the show 13 Reasons Why. And while I applaud the show for starting the conversation about suicide, especially among teenagers, one of the drawbacks was that it romanticized it and it placed the blame on peers, right? So then what happened was, when we saw children completing suicide in the high school, everyone was blaming the bullies, right? So then the bullies became the bullied. And one thing that was really hard for us to make them understand is that in almost every case of completed or attempted suicide, the underlying reason is going to be depression and other mental health diagnoses. While the bullying and whatnot might exasperate that, not more times than not, it wasn't just because of this bully. It was because of other contributing factors. So things going on at home, an underlying mental health diagnoses, lack of support. So there's other things going on as well. And 13 Reasons Why did not do the best job of modeling and showing help-seeking behaviors, right? So that's something to kind of be mindful of also, and how other shows kind of exasperate these ideas that, oh, it's always the bully's fault, and not looking at other things that might be contributing as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see someone put in the chat box about how if friends or peers die by suicide or attempt suicide, a lot of times we see a spike among their peers attempting suicide as well. So that's something to be very mindful of as professionals, is that anytime someone loses someone close to them to suicide, it puts them at a higher risk of attempting suicide as well.
Also, they've been investigating some of these cluster suicides that happens. It has happened more often in more rural areas. And what has been found in these cluster suicide completions is that they made some type of pact that, you know, they would do it. So peers, that strong group dynamic can contribute to them actually completing the suicide.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if these individuals are the only source of support that these youth have as well. Also, unfortunately, our society does not view mental health as being equally important as physical health, right? So something that I often kind of use as a metaphor for clients, right, is if you had asthma, what would you do? Would you just lay there and not be able to breathe? Or would you seek help? And I use this as a metaphor for parents too, right? If your child had asthma and was having trouble breathing, what would you do? And the answer is always, well, I'd bring them to the doctor so we can get them an inhaler and get them medicine and get their lungs to work. So why is it different for mental health concerns, right? Instead of saying, oh, well, you're sad, so just kind of figure it out, or just think happy thoughts, look at it the same way you would look at a physical health concern, bring them to get help. I normally use asthma and diabetes as two metaphors when I'm discussing this with clients and their parents, because those are two that they kind of just instantly are like, no, those are things you have to treat. Those are things you need help for. And also being mindful of the shame surrounding suicide, as we talked about earlier, and how that can contribute to people not seeking help as well. So in our research and in discussions we've had and whatnot, Dr. Sparkman-Key and I have come up with a few different interventions that we think would be especially helpful in helping to decrease the stigma on more of a societal level. So some of these include teaching empathy, emotions, so emotion identification, being able to talk about emotions, as well as teaching coping. So one thing that we talked about is doing this in the schools, right? So our kids are taught, like, cough into your elbow. If you're sick, stay home. Like, they're taught about germs at school. So why aren't we teaching our kids about emotions and empathy and coping and these really important deterrence to mental health stigma? Why aren't they being taught that at school? So maybe as mental health professionals, considering doing that in your community, at schools, having community conversations about these things as well.
And often what we've seen that schools do is often they will tell kids, you know, don't talk about what happened today, don't talk about Sarah, because they're doing it in an attempt to protect Sarah, but what they're really doing is stigmatizing suicide.
Right.
Because they can't talk about it. They can't, you know, look at this person anymore. They can't be concerned about her anymore. And they have all these questions and stuff about suicide. And yet they're being told not to say anything. And anyone who says anything is going to be disciplined. And so that further stigmatized suicide, because really these kids need to talk about it because they need to have a better understanding of what it is, what the symptoms and stuff that contributed to this, so they can better interact with Sarah, but also recognize those symptoms in their friends. And what I found is schools are uncomfortable, and I'm just saying the systems are uncomfortable having some of these conversations. And so they're not happening. They're really saying, don't say anything, don't interact with her, you know, leave her be, that type of thing. And we're getting more support from talking in the community. And so more counselors, more people in mental health education need to be more willing to go out into the community and actually have these conversations to speak with you.
Yeah, and I see that Susan put in the chat, do you think that school staff or counselors are confused about the difference in suicidal thoughts as opposed to just frustration? Yeah, so what can we do to help individuals within these systems to recognize kind of the difference, right? To recognize, like, is this child suicidal? Or is this child just stressed and frustrated, right? So one of the things that I highly recommend, so we actually did this at the high school that I was working at for that short period of time. We had, it's called Safe Talk trainings. And we had those trainings. So we had an actual trainer come into the school and train our kids on Safe Talk. And what Safe Talk did is it taught the kids how to recognize suicidality in their peers and in themselves, and how to address it and how to speak to it. So I would say starting off with having that training for staff for all school personnel, because you never know who it's going to be that the child is most comfortable talking to, from the lady in the cafeteria to the janitor who they see cleaning up the baseball field, right? So having the entire school personnel trained in safe talk or something comparable to safe talk, and then having perhaps your peer leaders at school trained in these things, and then eventually, once the funding hopefully is available, having all of the students trained in these sorts of suicide awareness trainings would be really helpful as well.
And I think someone asked, how should schools maybe handle the situation?
Mm-hmm.
I think we shouldn't wait for an instance to happen at our schools in
Mm-hmm.
order to have these conversations. I think that we need to start really having a conversation without an incident happening. I do think once
Mm-hmm.
something happens, it's too late, and the focus becomes to protect the child that
Mm-hmm.
actually made the attempt, and the focus is not on educating the students.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if the focus was on educating the students in advance, maybe it could have prevented the attempt.
Right. And also being mindful of, instead of saying, okay, we're not going to talk about it to protect Susie, instead of talking, I mean, the kids are going to talk about it, and it's something that they're trying to grapple with and cope with anyway. So by telling them to not cope with it, to not talk about it, you're removing yourself and school personnel as a source of support for these children who are trying to make sense of what happened to their peer. So instead, what I've seen a lot of schools doing is having an assembly, right? Or having someone come in, so having counselors from the community come in and talk to every home room group and saying, look, this is what happened to Susie. That way, first of all, it's just facts that are being presented, as opposed to all the rumors spreading through the rumor mill and the grapevine, right? And then explaining, like, you know, we can't blame anyone for what happened to Susie. That's just going to be more harmful to everyone. Normalizing the feelings and reactions that the children are feeling, and then letting them know where to go for support and for help. And a lot of the times that also becomes kind of a Kickstarter for more conversations within the schools as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we're running short on time because we're both talkers. So we're going to kind of fly through the rest a little bit quicker. And then we'll give you all our email address in case you want a copy of the presentation as well, or if you have any questions.
Mm-hmm.
So normalizing mental health, making it something that you talk about more in communities and in society in general, and encouraging help seeking. So showing help seeking as something that's just as normal as going to your hairdresser or your barber or going to church, right? So making it something that's just routine for some people. And representation of help seeking by culturally diverse individuals, right? How often is it that when you turn on the TV, the people that are shown in the media as going to a counselor, how often are they actually diverse groups of people? So that could be helpful as well. Like Dr. Key mentioned earlier, increasing mental health literacy, teaching more about mental health, and then being more knowledgeable about the historical impacts of mental health in different cultural groups. So then at the community level, so having those safe spaces where individuals can have these conversations, like we mentioned earlier, in schools, for example, and promoting holistic and alternative interventions, right? So some people aren't going to want to take antidepressants, and that's okay, that's their right. But instead, also being knowledgeable about different alternative interventions that can be used as well, that come from a more holistic perspective. That's something that I've been looking into lately, and it is absolutely amazing. It's so interesting. And then working collaboratively with spiritual and religious leaders. So since they are often, as someone mentioned in the chat earlier, they're often kind of the front line, and they're more accessible, they're more known in the community, they're more trusted, helping us as mental health professionals to help provide trainings to religious and spiritual leaders, so that they are better prepared to deal with these things. Also, making those connections with the spiritual leaders in our communities, so that if they're ever they ever do get a parishioner who comes to them and they're like, you know what, I really don't feel like I'm the best first person to help them through this, they have someone that they trust, that they're willing to kind of refer off to.
And I recently learned that there are only two seminary schools in the world that actually even touch on mental health. Yet, the mental health leaders are the first person that people go to for mental health challenges. That is an issue. That is a real issue. So really, and I do know there's a movement in some churches to have counselors right on staff, mental health
Mhm.
counselor centers on their staff, and they really starting to preach that you need both, Jesus and a counselor, which is a really
Mhm.
good thing.
Yes.
But more needs to be done, because there are still those churches where the leaders feel that they are the ones to provide that counseling, and that some mental health issues can just be prayed out, that it's demonic,
Mhm.
opposed to actually being something that can be treated, right, as a medical, or as we would treat asthma or anything like that. Um, so we have work to do. And I
Mhm.
always encourage people to, try to collaborate with the church to have these conversations, either at their church as a community conversation or at another site.
Yeah, and I know that we're saying church a lot, but like someone mentioned, yes, same thing
Yeah.
goes for different religious groups, right? So mosques, temples, etc. What I highly recommend is try to know the different religious leaders and the different spiritual leaders within the different communities in your area. That way you can kind of work collaboratively, and you can use them as a source of knowledge as well. They can help you to understand your clients a little bit better also. But of course, being mindful of confidentiality and whatnot also. Um, yeah, I like that. Someone put in the chats about how one way to kind of build that bridge between the church and the mental health professionals is keeping in mind that Jesus um, is often described as being the great, wonderful counselor. Another way that I've found has been helpful in kind of getting buy-in from religious individuals is describing it as, well, doesn't the Bible also mention that faith without works doesn't
Hmm.
work?
Hmm.
So, you can continue to pray. We can pray together if that's something that you need us to do in our therapeutic relationship. But it's also something that you have to put in the work for as well. Being present at community events helps to kind of get yourself out there and allows people to see that, oh, she or he, mental health professional, really does care about our community and our mental health, because look, they're here with us. So that can be really helpful as well. And just kind of hosting community programs. I know Dr. Sparkman-Key has done a number of these where she's had these community conversations to
Hmm.
help destigmatize things, and to also like disperse accurate information about resources to community groups. And that can also be community programs that you do to help increase self-confidence and self-worth in individuals, promote resilience in the community, and just help normalize help seeking. So having those community conversations, we mentioned already school-based education, and also promoting extracurricular activities as a way of increasing social support and purpose. Because if children and youth and adults as well, if we have a sense of purpose and a sense of connection, we're less likely to turn to suicide and attempt suicide. All right, and then within families. So, encouraging families to have more honest and transparent conversations about mental health, and kind of doing some of that myth busting. So, being more open, more honest, and just kind of talking more openly about emotions, right? So, how many dinner tables are people really talking about feeling sad, feeling depressed, feeling angry, feeling hopeless? It's not happening. But if it is happening, then that kind of helps the family system to be another source of support for individuals who might be suicidal. Also, educating parents. So, within those community talks, having some like Dr. Kia's had specifically for parents,
Hmm.
to help educate them about suicidality so that they can see the signs within their family as well. And then informing them of resources. Like we said earlier, if they're not sure where to go, then what can we really expect them to do?
And I think one thing that I found is that the parents were concerned about their kid. They knew that depression or something exists, but they didn't know what step to take. Like, they would come up to me and say, "What should I do?" And in some of these cases was really obvious that they needed to do something right away, but they didn't know what to do, so they hadn't done anything. In one case, a young kid, maybe 8 years old, was being locked in the bathroom and told to kill herself
Mm-hmm.
by other students. To me, that's, removing my kid from the school
Mm-hmm.
immediately. But for her, she didn't know what to do at all, right? And so we can't always assume that these parents know what to do. They know it's serious, but they don't know what to do or what step to take. And they're looking for someone to tell them what steps to take, right? And so that's why these community type of conversations is so important, because we can't assume that people know.
Yes. All right, and then here is my email address, as well as Dr. Sparkman-Key's email address and her fabulous website. So please feel free to reach out to either or both of us for more information, further support. And then, as Dr. Key put in the chat, she recently did an excellent TEDx talk on preventing suicide, especially in Black communities. So feel free to search for that as well. You won't be disappointed. Do we have any questions before we wrap up?
Before we go to questions, hi, this is Danita Hudson again. I'm one of the co-chairs. I just need to get some information out to your participants before they start to leave the room. Everyone, for us to be able to issue CEs, we need to have your full name in our list of attendees. We have to verify attendance. If you did not do that, I'm not going to ask you to change it now. I'm going to post my email in the chat. If you could just email me, and you only have to do this for one session if you change your name for your other sessions. Just email me and let me know you were in attendance today. And these are only for those that need CEs. Or I know we have some students whose supervisors have said they can attend the conference as indirect hours. And so if you need to make sure that if they were to contact us that we can prove that you were here, then you also want to email me. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Augustine and Dr. Key. I did privately message people to get their names for attendance. So if you could respond to the private message, that'd be great. Apologize for the beginning of the session being rocky. I was in the wrong room. So can everyone just say thank you to our presenters today, Dr. Key and Dr. Augustine. It was very informative, and I know a lot of people are saying thank you and stuff as you guys are.
Absolutely. We are glad that you found it helpful, and we're happy to have been able to participate in this.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Who do we send the email to get CEs, question mark?
Hey, Candace. It's good to see you. This is Linda McWhorter. She put her email in the, it was from Lori Soley, Danita Hudson at the Chicago Medical School.edu. I believe that was her.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have someone in the room that could give me host permission to share my screen?
I don't think so. I think the hosts have left.
Okay.
Just us left here.
Oh, goodness.
Kelly, I'm going to reach out to Danita Hudson via email and see if she can help us too. And then Lori.
Okay. Says I don't think you need host control to share your screen, but it's not letting me.
Yeah, it says it disabled it for participants, it looks like.
And it looks like someone's still recording, so I don't know if they're also.
Let's see.
This session is on destigmatizing the capability of counseling the military, for those who are wondering in the chat.
All right, I just sent them the email. I made it high priority. I'm sure they're busy, but I also sent our room.
Oh, it says someone. Let's see if they're in our room.
Jamie Raditz should be our room monitor. Um, I don't see Jamie in here.
Either.
Okay.
Let me see if I can. I think this is Dr. Soli's room, I believe.
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can find the login information for her room.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Do you want to at least get started on the objectives?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, you want to at least introduce ourselves?
No one will get to see our nice little visuals, but we'll quickly. So welcome everyone. You are attending Destigmatization of the Capability of Counseling the Military. So hopefully you're all in the right room. We welcome you and we thank you for attending our presentation. My name is Kelly Forzia-Pytel and I'm a third-year doctoral student at Penn State University, and much of my work surrounds military counseling and military issues. And much of this work is actually in collaboration with my colleague and mentor here, Dr. Nicole Akurai-Sanders. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, so Nicole Arcuri-Sanders. I'm core faculty over at Capella University. Very similar to Kelly, the military population has really been my passion area. It's really been the area of advocacy, social justice, my clinical work, research. It's really been something that I dive right into. And we have spent I don't even know how many hours along the years of just really domino effect with research of question after question. And one of the major things that we keep coming to, unfortunately, is the fact that this culture does really face a lot of stigma, whether it's with, conducting research, getting participants, publishing. So this is definitely a presentation that we hope you really enjoy, and we hope we can have some conversation about if you're facing any barriers or what you're facing with this culture, and hopefully we can give you some guidance too and things that we have found that worked.
Yeah, so the objectives for this presentation, by the end of this, we really hope that you understand that military culture is often misunderstood. And that's mainly what we're finding due to a lack of inclusion in training programs. So this presentation is really going to discuss military culture, common cultural counseling issues, and then we're hoping that you'll leave with some strategies as counselor educators and supervisors to train students in effective counseling services for this group. So evidence will support how by increasing the competent military counseling and counselors in the field, we can then destigmatize mental health services for military connected individuals who are seeking care. I'm gonna just try to share my, nope, still not there. Okay. So as an overview, we just want to explain again that the military population is a unique culture and it holds very exclusive values, beliefs, traditions, and language. And just as the service members and the family members need to learn the culture, so do those who are interested in working with them in settings such as counseling. So those outside of the military culture, they may have a lot of difficulty in understanding military culture, given that it functions so differently and how life works outside of it. And when we say outside of it, military versus civilian culture. We'll have a very specific slide dedicated to military culture, but you'll see that by not understanding that, it can be quite a barrier to care. And we're going to be talking a lot about barriers to care. And I know that people are having a difficulty hearing me. So let's see if I can like move a little closer. So we'll go through, oops, sorry. I heard someone talking.
You are coming through clear and very clearly.
Oh, thank you. So,
and just so you know, Kelly, I'm sorry, someone's helping me. I'm in the chat box right now trying to get the contact of the host to see if there's any way they can possibly make you the host as well.
thank you. So by explaining the culture, we'll also explain barriers, and there's a lot of different barriers related to competent treatment of this group. So as long as everyone's okay, I'm just gonna keep talking. Culture generally, if we just start there, start breaking down these ideas, you know, when we're looking at counselors, they encounter a variety of different cultures in the counseling setting. So we must be prepared to work with clients from these varying cultures. And that's all part of multicultural counseling. So we've all, if we're students or if we're clinicians in the field, had that foundational course on multicultural counseling. And within that, you engage in these different viewpoints and perspectives. And what's interesting is military culture is not always discussed as one. So I don't know how many times Dr. Akurai Sanders and I have engaged with people in counseling settings and outside of them that kind of looked at us skeptically related to the military being a culture. So when we look at what culture actually is, it refers to these learned practices of individuals, and you know, this could be communication patterns, it could be morals in a given group or community, and then these cultures are also very dynamic. So we need to sort of follow them and understand them over time. So counselors not only need to learn and embrace their own cultural identity, but then also be able to have that self-awareness and personal values to be able to relate to their clients' values and viewpoints and respond using these culturally appropriate assessments and interventions. And it looks
Kelly, good news. You're just able to get you to be host.
okay. Now let's look here. So this should be, we'll just flip through this a little bit here. And just generally talking about culture and why it's important, really to now talk about military culture. So is military culture a unique culture? Military culture is a unique culture. And that's because this culture holds very exclusive values, beliefs, traditions, and languages. The DoD's core values, if we just look at those, they consist of integrity, ethics, honor, courage, and loyalty. And beliefs are really surrounding the good of the group and the mission. So it's less on that individual who is serving and more on the greater good. Chain of command in the military, that's where these orders are being passed down. So when we're really talking about, difference between civilian and military, this is a huge piece where there's orders that are passed down through this hierarchy of higher ranked personnel to lower ranked until it's received by the people who are to implement the order. And then within this, the military is speaking very unique language. So the language is part of, they have acronyms, they have slang, some are actually branch specific, but then, others are just broadly related to all branches. And some of us as civilians, we're aware of this through, media exposure. So AWOL would be an example of something, absent without leave, or boots on the ground, meaning that there's people in a particular location. Those would all be, considered military language in how they speak in a unique fashion. Additionally, they use the specific alphabet. So if you see it there, it's probably a little bit small for some of you, but it's phonetic. So it's to ensure that there's these critical combinations of letters that can be pronounced and transmitted and received appropriately by others. I don't know if any of you recall being on the phone with insurance agencies and trying to clarify the spelling of your name by repeating back something like A. Did you say A as in alpha? And some of us are like, no, A as in apple. I mean, yeah, I guess alpha. But this is, the alphabet that they're using to speak with you, and military personnel use it quite frequently. Along with that, they have these unique military laws that are explaining the rules and regulations for service. So both military service members and their families are expected to be part of this community, but it's also structured by these expectations, rules, and guidance. And again, all of this is really to show you how the military culture is unique, and by not understanding it, when you're working with clients in a counseling setting, it can be quite the barrier to care if they're constantly saying you're not understanding me, or feeling like they need to explain themselves and why their stressors are so present in this context. In this year, 2020, it's actually marking 19 years since over 2.7 million service members have been called to support counterterrorism operations since the attack on the United States in 2001. Since then, service members have been involved in this service have been reporting a variety of mental health issues. So anything from mood disorders, trauma, substance use, moral injury is a big one that people are talking about now related to this group. And what's interesting is there's military specific programs for care that are increasing to help support and build resiliency. However, many service members, as well as individuals connected to the military, are still discussing barriers to care, where studies have shown that half of those who need mental health services actually go on to receive this care. So, today we're really going to focus on what these barriers to care look like.
And just to kind of follow up on what Kelly was saying in regards to the population. So, right, we have all of these different branches, right? We have 5 different branches of the military. So the culture also varies per branch. Also varies if you're a reservist versus active duty, if you're National Guard. With, COVID-19, and we just left another presentation, and it's, it's such a timely thing, and it's thinking about culture and gender, and how does that connect with this presentation and connect with this idea of stigma. And it's a different experience for the military right now. So I am a military spouse, and we have been ordered, that we cannot travel active duty or military dependent until May 15th. They are heavily regulating that right now. They know where all our whereabouts are. My husband does accountability check-ins every single morning by 7 a.m. So it's a different life. So even when we're talking about counseling this population, their experience with COVID-19 is going to be a little bit different. Our acronym use, our language, what we are experiencing on base, or known as an installation, is a little bit different than what is happening in some of the civilian areas. Or currently, I know everything on the news lately, we're hearing about USS Comfort, and a whole bunch of different, deployments that are going out to aid in these efforts. And, what we thought was happening here, we are now missing a very large population of providers in our hospitals. I'm located in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So it's very interesting because my experience is a little bit different than maybe somebody out in the community, and we're in the same county. So that's just something, to consider with this. And then the other thing that Kelly brought up, and I just want to, bring attention to, because you're going to hear it throughout this presentation, about that 19-year mark. So, right, when we had 9/11, we had terrorist action actually on our home soil in the US, something very different for us. So these individuals who had served during Iraqi freedom, is what they call the operation, is going to look different than those who did not maybe serve combat related. And then also whether it was, the Vietnam War, Gulf War, every experience of every individual is going to look different. And that includes even with their MOS, their military service occupation. So if you are artillery, if you are infantry, if you are, medic, there's so many different roles that they serve in, that their experience is going to be very, very different. So having a background about how their culture looks during these time periods is going to give us kind of a background, the context of where we can enter with them, because it's going to be very different than what some of our civilian counterparts are experiencing during that very same time.
Thank you. And I think that's an important note when we're transitioning over to barriers and counselors and their experiences trying to work and access this population. There's major barriers related to treatment for this group, and it's both at the individual as well as the system level. So starting with counselor barriers, we can see that there's counselors who, looking at their attitudes and their confidence about working with this group, some of them have the lower confidence because maybe they have lower confidence because it hasn't been incorporated into their training programs. They've never thought about it as being a unique culture to work with, or because of that, they think that they have this, misunderstanding or this assumption that because they're not military connected, they couldn't possibly work with this group. How could they go to understand these experiences, and how could they, not knowing the history of war and the current climate of war, how could they learn that so quickly in order to understand their clients? So looking at counselor competence and confidence today, we really need to make sure that it's being infused into training programs so that it's not these providers being unable to fulfill these needs because of lack of knowledge and misunderstanding, but really, opening up their eyes to, if you want to work with this group, you can. Your learning needs are going to be a little bit different. So counselor barriers, there are quite a few, along with just access in general for this group. So expanding this a little bit, access to care for those who are military connected, it's also part of them being able to even receive an appointment. So having long wait times or limited services due to the geography in which the service member and their family are located, by increasing counselors who are competent to work with this group, we can really try to decrease that access issue for them. But historically, there's a lot of organizations. So when we look at TRICARE, they have very strict paneling requirements, as does the DoD and DoD affiliated settings, where they don't really understand the identity of the counselor when they're compared to other mental health providers, such as social workers, psychologists, that have been in their environments for so long. So making sure that we also are advocating on the identity of the professional counselor, saying, you know, we are, as counselors, equally trained to treat mental health issues. And, you know, our training programs are setting us up to do this. That will also help improve the number of individuals who can work and access the military on both the counselor side as well as, you know, for the individual seeking care. And we've alluded a little bit to this earlier, but the military does see stigma related to mental health and accessing mental health services because of the military training service members to really be stoic and internalize a lot of their feelings. If they're showing these signs of weakness, you know, related to stress or, and that could be, you know, stress related to family or just internal stress, they're seen as, you know, not combat ready, and that can really impact themselves with command and how command views them. You know, they may be considered or ruled unfit for duty in some cases if they try to seek services. So this could really, you know, lead to a lot of negative consequences, loss of security clearances, loss of promotion, even medical discharge from service. So, you know, we want to try to reduce barriers as much as possible. And part of that is really understanding the stigma related to mental health, which there's a lot of efforts in place. But if we finally do that, and then we're sending people to providers who aren't competent or there's not enough, it's just, we're trying to break down all of these barriers along the way. So how can we do that through? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, just to kind of lean off of Kelly, what she said, and just kind of going through the chat box with some of the comments going on. The idea of a service member, whether you are reservist, active duty, you know, whatever you fall in, you've had 1 year of experience or 20 years of experience, the simple act of walking into a counseling center can be very threatening. Because it can say right there, you're walking in, does that mean that you are unfit for duty? So that is something just to consider. There's been a lot of research out there, specifically more with veterans. The active duty is a harder population to get into in regards to, you know, get in the DoD to approve your research. So you have to do a lot of back routes in order to get that information. However, the adrenaline, the nature setting outside of the typical office, that is where they are seeing our service members really benefiting. Equestrian, so working with horses, animal assisted therapy, going for hikes. You will see tons of different things hiking with veterans, water sports, like this adrenaline junkie, but this warrior, right? This idea to also be possibly in a group and help others, which they are very used to in their culture. So understanding their culture is also going to be a way to look at some of these barriers and how do we advocate for ourselves as counselors to gain access. What is the areas that service members are seeking, even as I like to call it, secretly. So behind closed doors, that possibly that they are worried about their chain of command, finding out where are they going. And you will find a lot of that research from where do they go once they are done with their service. And you will find that many of these veterans, service members do not seek VA services because, right, that can be connected. So they will seek civilian-based services. So we will have many, many military-connected individuals among civilian sectors, whether they are active duty, reservists, whether they are retired, whatever their status is. So it's something that we should all just be mindful of in moving forward. And James brought up a point about, you know, how much information is out there for programs in regards to the cultural piece of working with them. We'll go a little bit more into this as we go through the presentation, but a great place to just kind of look at to help you get a great glimpse of it. If you look at the ACA Clearinghouse for example, multicultural syllabuses, you will notice, right, we will see Hispanic, Latino, we will see Native American populations, we will see a lot more ethnic exploration in regards to what culture is. However, when you will look at it, you will not see military listed there. Research that we have conducted, we have found that many participants who were students in CACREP as well as non-CACREP programs reported that they did not receive any information in regards to what military culture is. And then there was a small majority that said, I think we read about a paragraph. So it was really interesting because they said, this is my area of interest, but I never had the opportunity to explore anything further with this population until after I was done with my master's program.
And to add to that too, it's interesting because then there's like the all or nothing approach where people understand military culture, so they say broadly, but then they're not really understanding the unique individuals within that and the struggles between having those unique, say, ethnic identities, that because they're part of the military, they're not able to be individualized in a sense. So I saw that, you know, Isabella was talking in the chat about the different internal stigmas or different experiences about, you know, having been engaged in a deployment experience versus those who have not. I think, you know, the way that we're moving with our presentation, you can see that we need to consider that the unique experiences, and there could be pros and cons to having served and having not for that very reason, over identifying with clients or, you know, feeling like you can't at all because you haven't had those experiences. So thank you all for what you're adding to the chat. It's really, really going alongside with a lot of the important points that we're trying to make today. So moving over to providing counseling services.
Okay, so we kind of talked a little bit about this. I know because there's been, as Kelly had said, there's just so much great dialogue going on in the chat box. So we're trying to incorporate it, you know, with time and so forth, be cognizant of where your interest is in this topic. So, right, we talked about the ACA clearinghouse in regards to syllabuses. There's a lack there. I told you about some of our research that has been reported. And then something that we should consider though, right? Because there was comments in here about supervisors, command, right? This idea that possibly our counseling trainees, counselors in training, are not getting this education because of supervisors. And then also we have mental health supervisors not being open to the military. And then we also have the military service member who is fearful of retaining these services because of their command, their supervisor, right? So there's this idea of that's this like trickle effect, that it's kind of coming from a head down approach of what this stigma may be putting on for, or a barrier for the stigma to go away. So as a supervisor, so if any of you guys ever have interns, or if you're at a university and you are training counselors to be, whether they are in their fieldwork position, or you're teaching an ethical or legal course, or whatever course it can be, there's ways of infusing culture. And as a supervisor, right, if you look at KCREP standards, we are required as a university to provide our students with these training areas, 8 core areas, to include cultural competency areas. Also, with that being said, we are to meet them where they need to be. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But you have the ethical responsibility when you serve as a supervisor role. Now, does everyone do it? We might do it in a way of, yes, we talked about culture, we can't meet everybody's needs, but how do we get creative in making sure that our students do get their interests met? So maybe if we're doing cultural immersion activities, we ask them to pick a population they would like to work with. If they are doing a paper about a culture, we ask them, maybe we assign some, right? Because you have to also know the background, right? When I always tell students, I say, you know, you might have a service member, but just because he's a Marine does not mean that Marine is the same as that Marine. That Marine is a Puerto Rican background. He's had 3 years and he's had 4 tours that included combat. That individual, he also has a Puerto Rican background, but he's never practiced that culture before. He was raised this way, right? So complete different experience. His deployments were different. He's had 12 years experience. However, this is his MOS. There's so much context that can be shared, that could be explored for even just your students to understand your clients are all unique and we need to meet them where they are, and they're here now. So a very parallel process for us as supervisors, because we also need to meet our students where they are for now. But just remembering as supervisors, right, KCREP and also ACA guide us to doing this. So if we are advocating for a need to change or incorporate different creative approaches to allow our learners and students to get this experience, we have KCREP and ACA Code of Ethics on our side there. So this is kind of a little bit repetitive in regards to just the fact of cultural norms. We talked about this earlier before we even had our PowerPoint up a bit about, you know, values, beliefs, and customs being different. And for every culture, it's different. And for every context that the client has experienced the culture, it is different. Kind of like the example I just gave before. So knowing your client, knowing their experience is really important. I know specifically with supervisees, students, I stress the importance of that biopsychosocial, that intake so much, because you get really this idea, this picture that tells you where to start. You start to hear their lingo. It tells you where do you need to do your homework. So that is something really to take into consideration, despite what population you work with, right? So it doesn't change our job if you are a supervisor here. Something to consider is that supervisors often take 2 approaches. There's an emic approach and an etic approach. So an emic approach is this idea that we're really going to jump in and we're really going to learn the culture. And we're going to give them the opportunity to know this culture inside and out. The etic approach is, hey, we have these great counseling skills and they are transferable to each population. Now, the trick here that I often say is with the etic approach, right? Foundational skills, we teach them to our students or supervisees. We are assessing them. They're monitoring for their effectiveness, right? It's foundational to all counseling. However, our ACA Code of Ethics guide us to ensure that our supervisees or us as counselors are culturally competent. So even if you take an etic approach where all your skills are transferable, you still need to have some understanding of what that culture needs from you in the role of a counselor in order to best service them. And I always tell students, when you think about servicing military, use that word, because service is a good word to relate to that population, right? So I am not here counseling you. I am providing you a service, just like you provide a service. And it can really change a dialogue. But that comes with understanding a culture. So you can use those ACA Code of Ethics to really support you in these efforts. Okay, so I know I keep saying ethics, 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 right? And this is kind of my push of advocacy and Kelly's push for advocacy in regards to how do we stop facing these stigmas? You know, why are we getting so much reports in our research that says I've never had an opportunity, even when I've asked to learn about this culture? So, right, counselors, we get the opportunity to, when we provide, I always say we're given that gift back of supervising that next generation to come, to give them an opportunity to explore their areas of interest. So if ever questioned, why are you doing what you're doing, right? We have those codes of ethics to help us. If you look at your state licensure boards, majority of them reference the ACA Code of Ethics, and they say we follow them and we're aligned with them. But you will also see state statutes regarding your specific needs of your client and being in tune to the needs of your client. So that right there is another reason why, you know, it is okay to assign a supervisee some non-direct hours to do some research on their client, to get a background, to understand it. And then we'll go into a little bit in a slide or two about why that is important for a counselor, whether you're a student counselor or if you are a new counselor, an old counselor, to have that background. Because some of those things that Kelly spoke about earlier in the PowerPoint with like acronyms, if you are sitting there looking at your client going, I don't understand, right? There's going to be a disconnect. So being able to do your homework and being able to understand the background of what your client is saying, that is also going to build rapport, because they feel like they can confide in with you more because you're following, right? We're not going to know everything. I tell my students all the time, and I even tell my clients, I can do as much homework as I want, but I'm not going to know every single thing about this population. So you are the expert. I am here for you to guide me. I want you to teach me. I'm going to do my work too to make sure that you feel confident that I can meet your needs. But also, you know, your world, your experience is not going to be the same as every sailor or every soldier. So I want to know it through your eyes. And that's the same thing we say to all our clients. So it's just really letting them know that you're there for them, to meet them in their here and now.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is, you know, we have an example here, which again goes with common misconceptions of the group. If we're talking about that participant who shared, I only read about the culture in a paragraph in a textbook. Well, what paragraph and what textbook? Was it diagnosis, where they were only talking about the prevalence of PTSD or substance use or career issues, right? That's a very narrow focus, and it leads to a lot of generalization if we don't allow our students or supervisees to go and do that research, because then they think, oh, well, all veterans have combat PTSD. And a lot of what the chat was saying earlier was that may not actually be the experience of everyone. Maybe they didn't even, you know, deploy, or they never saw combat. So, you know, just keeping in mind that there are these truly unique experiences, but we need to make sure that we're supporting our students and supervisees or colleagues in a way that they realize that they're not taking this narrow view of a culture and really opening it up to, okay, this is the client in front of me and these were their experiences. And I know the culture enough to not make these huge jumps that could hurt.
And Kelly, thank you for using that word huge jump. I also say a lot of times to my students and supervisees, what about adjustment disorder? Why did we just say they have PTSD, right? So just because somebody was in the military or in the service, right? We don't just categorize them. That's part of the stigma that we are combating here. So, you know, whether it's a training, maybe it's a difficult training, maybe they're active duty and they're nervous about it. Maybe it's a PCS, a position change of station, a move that's coming up. There's tons of different things that can happen that can symbolize and resemble the same symptomology, but we don't just jump, right? Because there's so many books out there. I'm sure if you type in a Google search, you know, military disorders, you see PTSD everywhere. You don't see the other things. You know, service members also suffer from depression. They also suffer from anxiety. You know, they do have adjustment disorders. I know somebody mentioned in the chat being a military spouse and just having, it's a whole nother world. You know, that idea too for a family, right? The family doesn't have PTSD maybe because dad or mom is combat deployed right there. They may be having a really hard adjustment, something that's going on in the house. So, right, it might not be conduct disorder for that child right now. There is a deployment context that is affecting an adjustment. So that context is so important. If we just look at what we can Google search, right, we'd have stigma for years. So thank you for, you know, pulling that up, Kelly, because I think that's a big thing. It's like, well, I read this. And it's like, well, where? We talk a lot about now, and I'm sure everything with COVID-19, you know, what's real news and what's fake news. So I always, you know, tell students, you know, how do you substantiate that? Would you just say, I read it on someone's post, so it has to be real? Well, that might be their experience, but that is not the experience of majority. How would you know that? Where would you look to find that out? So yeah, so great points in telling too, where do you find your information? Ooh, good question, Michelle. Do you feel gender plays a big role in stigma of seeking assistance? Right, so females, we always are known as the emotional ones, right? And we, you know, want to talk about it. So there's a couple different things that impact gender differences within the service, and it also depends on the MOS. Right, so there's a lot more MOSs that are opening to females at this point in time. So, you know, for example, and I think of the artillery, because artillery is very largely male dominated. More and more females are starting to come into this MOS, and it's changing because now these males also have to adjust, how do they talk? You know, their living quarters are changing. They're not used to having to address having a female with them on deployments, whether it's training exercises or, you know, combat deployments or, you know, just in the field, at home, just checking on things, making sure that they're meeting all the requirements. So females in some MOSs have more pressure not to speak up, right? They need to fall in line because they have a very male dominated population. But then we also have to think of generational, right? We have a generational difference between talking about emotions versus not talking about emotions. So in the service, if you have somebody who's been in the service for 15, 20 years as a female, their journey may look very different from somebody who has 5 years in, or if they are enlisted versus officer. And even having them talk among each other, their experiences are very, very different. So in the Navy, there is a larger female population, specifically in the medical services. However, right, if you compare that to infantry, that's going to look different, and the context is going to look different. So there's this idea too. Yeah, we have an example here right in the chat about, it was a lot harder to get recognition, measuring up, right, promotions. So you already have the stigma of being a female in a male's job, right? For some, and it's a different world, and that's that idea of context and culture and why it is so important. So you can look at the slide, you'll see that there's different ways of working with service members and learning to work with them, right? So we have actually mentioned in the chat box about listening, right? Asking them, right? Let them know you are there for them. Empathy, being empathetic, getting more questions, open, close. Sometimes you need clarity. Other times, you need the longer story. You need that context where they tell you, I am the only female in my unit, right? That's going to look very different than I have 3 other people, 3 other females that I'm connecting with when we deploy. It's also going to look very different in if there's a role where they have a large female population that they connect with, right? That also is if they're living on base or not on base. So those who are living in barracks, right? There's different sets of rules. So when you're 18, right, and you're going off to college, mom and dad or whoever was taking care of you or you've kind of checked in with, you have a lot of freedom. Right? In the barracks, it's a different rule. Males and females, they can't interact. It's not like a dormitory, right? So there's a whole nother level of things going on. How many females are in that area where you're at? Could be where you're located too. So lots of context. Self-disclosure, this is something that I often say be careful of, right? Because self-disclosure could be that you were previous service member, could be that you are a reservist, for example, could be that you're a spouse, a dependent at some point, but your story, just like any other self-disclosure, should not take over the session, should not redirect the focus on your client to your experience. Biggest thing there. The other thing is you have to be mindful if you have a self-disclosure that it is not countertransference, that you are not now being implicated by this scenario. I have had some students along the way that have been previous service members, and we have had to talk about, I understand this is why you came into the counseling field. You wanted to work with specifically VA and service members, but you cannot separate. This is not a good population for you. But we still need to address, what about when that person walks into your civilian office? What are you going to do? Right? So supervisors have that job. And then reflecting. So same thing also, every other population we work with, you need to make sure that you're reflecting what was gained here, what was lost here, what can I do better? Also in regards to, did I meet my client's needs? Where were they lacking? What do I need so when I come back next time, I can be there better for them? But foundational skills never, ever go away.
And that ties really nicely to this comparison, and we won't talk a lot about it being mindful of time, but really counselors with prior military experience and those without. Some of the issues that can come into the counseling session in terms of disadvantages and advantages in both of these identities as a counselor. So we talked a little bit about the role of countertransference and transference if you've served, which may not be as much of an issue if you haven't served. But then again, you're also facing, for individuals without, difficulties understanding the worldview. So really understanding, okay, there's experiences and there's advantages and disadvantages for that counselor who is military connected in some way and not military connected in another way. I know I skipped a little bit for us.
That's okay. No, yep. So being mindful of time, guys. You guys are just having so many great points of conversation. We're loving the dialogue going on. So if there is anything that comes up where we didn't get to spend more time on, always feel free to reach out to one of us. We'd be happy to talk. So just to kind of segue from the idea that Kelly was just talking about, right? With you having experience or without experience, anyone can do it. So counselor, educators, and supervisors have this role of knowing where their students are, right? We use the codes to help us to support our strategies and our work with our students. We can use K-CREP if you're a K-CREP program, right? So we have to meet certain things. The biggest thing that I keep stressing is this. Just like you tell your students to meet clients where they are, you as the counselor educator, you as the supervisor, whether you're a field supervisor or a educator supervisor, meet your students where they are. If they need more background, right? And let's say I have a learner right now that I know is just very passionate about a population, but they don't really have much education about it or background understanding. They have a passion, but they don't really know the context and all the what ifs. I might have that student be doing a little bit more homework and reading and looking at research and having dialogue with me when we are case conceptualizing about the context of that population and the client she's working with. But another learner really may have had years of experience working in the field, kind of know a lot about the ins and outs and, you know, ethical and legal implications in working with the population. So maybe we don't focus as much as getting the background of it, but we look in other areas where we want to make sure that they are understanding skill-wise, that they are no longer in the other role. They are now a counselor. What does that look like? How is that different?
Yeah, those appropriate boundaries.
Yes, big one, big boundaries. And that goes along with, for anyone who's in the counseling education field, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? Meet them where they are. Very parallel to meet your clients where they are, but meet them where they are. That's the idea of differentiated instruction, right? So I know we just kind of zoomed through here a little bit. You can look at the ethical codes. There is tons out there to substantiate why you're doing what you're doing to meet clients where they are, which means you have to have your supervisees be ready to do that. However, use this stuff out there. And the reason why I keep saying is use it is because we can't break these barriers without us, anybody who's interested in saying, well, the ACA Codes of Ethics says I need you. And that's been kind of the roundabout way that Kelly and I have had to do a lot of our research and get in publications is we understand that you might not see it this way. However, let me explain to you, according to our profession's ACA Code of Ethics, why this area needs more exploration. So definitely, you know, use what you have. Keep asking questions. Saw so many great questions there. I think about like 9 studies that can come out from your questions. A big thing that I saw with telemental health, do you think it's going to help with this population? Right, and with COVID-19, I know military family life counselors, they've just actually gotten permission to go telemental health. For certain agencies, there's a lot of things translating now. States that didn't really advocate for it in the past are changing over to allowing it. If you look at state boards, there's pop-ups everywhere, alert, change to deal with COVID-19, right? Because an additional stress can really be harmful to our mental health populations. Isolation can definitely be harmful. So do I see it benefiting it? I hope. But however, those barriers still exist, right? Because now we have to really make sure HIPAA, right? Make sure nobody in command finds out for those that are really, you know, person to person interaction, possibly in passing in a nature-based counselor, right? The commander may never know. They just thought they were going for a hike or they were going for a horse ride. But now if I'm online and somebody finds out, right, that they met with a counselor online, well, that could be intimidating. And insurance. So if they cannot afford self-pay or it's not a free service, There's a couple programs out there that the Given Hour, which will work with military service members as well as dependents and girlfriends, boyfriends, family members, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa who are experiencing stress related to the military experience, is a free service, right? And it's non-trackable, doesn't go to command. However, you have to know these things. Putting in a TRICARE, that's the military insurance provider, bill, that could be very intimidating. Who's going to find out about this? And where does that diagnosis go? Will the VA one day find out? Everybody has issues. Everybody has things that they need to address, but this population specifically fears, if I am struggling with my marital problem and somebody finds out about my marital distress and they say that I was depressed, does that mean I also lose my job? So, just lots and lots to consider. So I know, Kelly, we're kind of out of time, so I'll turn it over to you.
And I think just to conclude is we need to all come together. It can't just be, me and Dr. Corey Sanders to continue this line of work and this advocacy, but really all of us, you're here today, you're here taking an interest in the military. Let's destigmatize the facts that there's people out there saying that not all counselors can competently work with the military, or that mental health professionals are not prepared to work with military connected clients unless they've had previous exposure or experience with the culture directly. There was a lot of stuff in the chat, you're identifying, you're really asking good questions and thinking like, are these things being talked about in the literature? Is there research here? What about this? What about this? The literature since 9/11 has really grown to focus on the military and extend to military connected, such as spouses' experiences, children's experiences. But really, there's so many unique groups within the military that we're still not giving a lot of attention to. And if you've got an area of expertise, maybe you look at that in relation to the military culture to really help create change and improve services and break down the barriers. So we only have 2 minutes. Any final thoughts, Dr. Akurai Sanders?
No, just thank you guys so much for being here. We know everything going on in the world. Life is not the norm, and you probably got a lot of things happening in your background right now. So we really do appreciate it, and we are loving the chat. And please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to connect and kind of keep pushing this forward. More people interested, the further we can go with it.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
So I'm hopeful that whoever is next will be granted host. So I'm gonna stop video and.
Is the person on here who's next? Because you might be able to change them over to it. Anyone in the room that's presenting here next?
And I will put in the chat our emails for those who ask, because I think the chat will stay for longer than our.
There's a question about how do you get credit in the just looking where, I know I printed it somewhere, the program, at the very top of the program, there's a link that you fill out where you've attended. It should say, I have it right here, I think. It's in the program. I believe it's on the second page, and then it's also towards the back of the program, and you just fill out a survey and it tells you what is your where you were at and what presentation. I think you have to do the 2 questions for each one, and it's supposed to give you credit. And then they gave us at our last group, Danita Hudson. She's somebody who's in charge with the school that you can message her as well.
Okay, well, I think I saw someone else that said that the next one may be canceled. So we're gonna log off.
Bye, everyone.
Next, enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you guys so much again for attending ours.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Stretch. Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, awesome. Okay, so unfortunately, the speaker that was scheduled to do Perfectly Imperfect had a family emergency and will not be able to join us this morning. So we'd encourage you to choose another session. So just wanted to let you guys know. I don't know who the room monitor is, but I just want to make sure everybody knows. So please choose a different session. This one we did have to unfortunately cancel this morning, but we'd love to have you at a different one. I will certainly try that, Jamie. I will see if I can get her presentation because I was very interested in this one as well. Hi, Shannon. I saw you just joined us. We actually had to cancel this one. Unfortunately, the presenter had an emergency, so just choose a different session.
Well, actually, I'm a monitor, so I was told to just come in and just let everybody know.
And I beat you to it, so.
All right, great. All right, well.
Shannon, if you want to go to a different session, I can sit in here for a little bit. I'm happy to.
Okay, I'm not signed up for another one, so do I just
go?
in?
You can just pop into one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you.
Nicole. I see you.
Hi, Lori. Sorry.
Enjoy the conference.
Yeah, thank you for having this. This is great and very timely right now.
I know, right?
Unfortunately, but yes, thank you.
I think we all needed this. We needed to feel connected.
Oh yeah, it's nice to actually hear people and see people.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with it all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. If you're just joining us, unfortunately, we had to cancel this particular session. We will try to get the information out later, but the speaker had an emergency. So I apologize. So choose another session. We'd love for you to join one of the other sessions. So hi, everybody. If you're just joining us, we had to cancel this session due to the presenter having a family emergency. So if you are just joining us, please choose one of the other sessions. We'd love for you to join one of the other sessions that are going on at this time. So hi, everybody. If you're just joining us, just to let you know, this session was canceled for this hour because the presenter had a family emergency. So please choose one of the other sessions and we will be happy to see you in one of those. Maggie, I think you just got on. We had to cancel this session. The presenter had a family emergency. So we're asking people to choose a different session to go to for this hour. Hi, if you're just joining us, we unfortunately had to cancel this session due to the presenter having a family emergency. So we're encouraging everybody to choose a different session to attend this hour. So if you're just joining us, please choose a different session. Like I said, we did have to unfortunately cancel this session. Hi, Jessica. We had to cancel this session due to the presenter having a family emergency. So we're encouraging everybody to check out a different session for this time period. Sorry for the notice. We just found out this morning.